Welcome to video 1 in chapter 2.7. Chapter 2.7 is industrial and employee relations. So how does this fit into the syllabus? So we are doing topic 2 at the moment, and this is chapter 2.7, industrial employee relations, and this fits as the 7th chapter in HR. So the syllabus looks like this. We're going to be doing various things. Where does conflict come from in the workplace? How can employees and employers put pressure on each other to get what they want? And then finally, we're going to look at how we resolve conflict within the workplace between employees and employers. So firstly, what are the various reasons for conflict in the workplace? Well, there are many. So some of the main ones are here. So for example, lack of job security. If employees don't feel like they've got security in their job, then clearly they're not going to be happy. Low salary is one for employees. Maybe working hours is one of them. So maybe employees want to work shorter working hours, or maybe the employer tries to give them work during their lunchtime. So that could be an issue. Poor or lack of communication. Inequity is a big one. So if employees are being treated differently, so maybe you're doing work, but then someone else is getting more money than you for the same work, then obviously that's going to cause conflict. Personality clash, different leadership styles. So if your boss has a certain leadership style that you don't like, then obviously that's going to cause conflict. Leadership styles are covered in chapter 2.3, leadership and leadership in 2.3. Expectations, again, we talked about maybe the company expects employees to work overtime, but employees don't want to, and most people don't want to, but that can be a source of conflict. Different values. Maybe there's been redundancies recently. We'll talk about that in another chapter. And then change and resistance to change. So maybe just move myself. So maybe the company wants to make changes, so new offices or moving where you sit, for example. And in general, as a species, we don't like change. Change is generally good for us, but we generally try to resist change because we don't like it. In general, not always. And it goes without saying that conflict is generally bad, not always bad, but in general, it's a bad thing. Within a business, it can lead to demotivated workers, and demotivated workers tend to be less productive, and they tend to leave. And if good people leave your business, then that can be an issue. So what we're going to do now is talk about industrial action. I'm going to move myself again. And industrial action is things we can do to put pressure on the other side of a disagreement in order to solve the conflict. Specifically here, we're going to be talking about when there's conflict, what can the employees do to put pressure on the employer to get what they want? So maybe we're talking about a situation here where the employees want a pay rise of 8%, but the company is only willing to give them a pay rise of 5%. Now, what can the employees do in this situation? Well, the first one's called collective bargaining, and this is when the employees collectively join together and negotiate with the employees as a group. And so maybe all of the employees within the business will join together, and then they will normally choose a representative. They might do that through a vote democratically, or they'll be chosen in some other ways. And so the main reason to do this is that generally employees will have more power when working together. And that's generally true. Whenever people get together into a group, that group is going to have more power than the sum of the individuals within that group. And so the employees can put more pressure onto the employer. And another example of this is a trade union. A trade union is when employees, again, join together to become a group. But the trade union now is an established organization that will act according to certain rules and laws even. So employees can join together to put pressure on the employer. The trade union is when they do this formally, and we'll talk about that later in another class. Now, if collective bargaining doesn't work, then the next thing they could do is to do something called work to rule. And a work to rule is when the employees only do what's in their contract. So they follow their contract, they're not doing anything wrong, the employer can't do anything about it, and they refuse to do any additional work. So one example might be the contract says work finishes at 5 p.m. And if employees were doing this, then at 5 p.m., they would stand up and they would leave the business. So maybe they're in a meeting, 5 p.m., they stand up and they leave the meeting. If they're working on the factory floor at 5 p.m., again, they stand up and they leave. Another thing might be no work during lunch break. So during lunch break, no one does any work. And it may be that normally the employer expects them to sometimes do work during the lunch break. And again, this is bad for the business because at 5 p.m. they lose any productivity. And maybe without the industrial action, sometimes employees will work later than 5 p.m. So in a lot of companies that happens. Maybe you finish at 5 p.m., but sometimes you stay a bit later just to get your work finished. So in this situation, that doesn't happen. And obviously that will be bad for the business. If that doesn't work, then maybe there's strike action. And strike action is an extreme example where basically they will say, we are not coming to work for this day or this week. And obviously this is bad for the business because no production or services will be provided during that period of time. Now, depending on the country, there'll be certain laws for how and when employees can strike. So it may be that the employees have to tell the business 2 weeks, a month in advance that they're going to strike. And this then gives the company time to prepare for that strike. Again, the specific rules depend on the country that they're in. So what about the other side? What about the employers? So now we're talking about the company. So in this situation, the company, the employees are trying to get something and the company doesn't or can't give that to the employees. So again, at the beginning, they can do collective bargaining. And this is the same as what we talked about in the previous slide. So in this situation, the company will meet with a representative of all the employees. And again, this saves the business time. So rather than having to negotiate with every employee separately, they negotiate with one person, one employee, who represents all of the employees. So this will save the business time, and it also makes the employees feel listened to. If that doesn't work, then the business can threaten redundancies. Now, redundancies is when the business says, we no longer need this employee. So it's similar to firing, but with firing, the employee has done something wrong. With redundancies, the employee leaves the business, but they haven't done anything wrong. They're just not needed anymore. So in this situation, some of the employees will lose their job, which again, and sometimes just the threat of that is enough to actually the employee to win the argument. Now, redundancies is covered in another chapter, but in this situation, the business would have to compensate the employees for getting rid of them. What the employer can also do, maybe, is to change their contract. So maybe the employees are doing work to rule where at 5 p.m. they stand up and leave the business. Well, what the business could do is change their contracts. Maybe 5 p.m. becomes 6 p.m. Or the contract says sometimes we can ask you to stay later than 5 p.m. Now, again, this depends on the country. It can be in some countries with strong labor laws, it can be very difficult to change the contract. But maybe if the employees are on a fixed contract for, say, a year, at the end of that 1 year, they could then potentially change that contract. Next, the employer could close the factory or close the business. Now, clearly, this is bad for the business because any production stops, any services stop. So the business is losing out here. But maybe the situation has got so bad that they need to do this. Now, in this situation, the workers don't get paid. And so any employee doesn't get paid, which means maybe they can't pay their bills, they can't pay their rent. An example I can give here is students. Imagine your teacher shut you out of the classroom for a week. Maybe you're happy about it. You're like, hey, free period. But then after a week, maybe 2 weeks, a month, maybe you start worrying about your education. Well, I'm not learning anything. What about the test that's coming up? And at that point, so this will take time. And eventually workers will say, okay, we need to get money here. We need to work. So maybe we can accept your demands. Now, if that doesn't work, an extreme option is to close the business. Everybody in the factory loses their job. Now, again, this is clearly a really extreme example because the business will then need to find somewhere else to work. But maybe they go to another part of the country, or maybe they can go to a country with cheaper workers, for example, and everyone would lose their job. So these are examples of what the employer can do to put pressure on the employee. We've covered all of those quite quickly. And next class, we will talk about how we can solve any conflicts.